Welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Strength and Power Coach at Wasps Rugby Union Football Club, Tom Mclaughlin. Hi guys, thanks for tuning into the Pacey Performance Podcast. Got another great guest coming up for you today in Tom Mclaughlin. Tom is the Strength and Power Coach at Wasps. We discuss his background, how he's got to where he is, and what exactly a Strength and Power Coach is. It becomes really difficult to actually condense what I want to ask these guys who come up on the podcast into a half an hour segment. But today I discuss conditioning rugby with Tom. We discuss integrating academy players through the process and into the first team. We also finish off with a discussion about Mark Ripperto and his recent article in T-Nation, which has caused a lot of controversy on social media. And towards the end of the chat, Tom also gives me his top 5 go-to guys in the industry and what these guys have contributed to his development. But before we get onto the interview with Tom, just like to remind everyone to give me a follow on Twitter at PaceyPerform, and from there you can keep up to date with everything that's going on the podcast. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, and it goes straight onto your phone or your tablet or your laptop. You can also give us a rating and a review on there, which would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, the more we get, the easier it is to circulate the name of the podcast and get the information out there. And if anyone does have any feedback on the podcast, good, bad or indifferent, I'd like to hear it, so drop us a message on Twitter or drop us an email. But before I go on anymore, here is the interview with Tom Mclaughlin. Okay, hi guys, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Today I have Tom Mclaughlin on the line. So just before I introduce Tom, just like to say a massive thanks to him for giving his time on his day off. So, Tom, do you want to give us a little bit of information on your background, your kind of education, your career, and what you're doing now?
Yeah, sure. So I started getting into strength and conditioning probably in 03, 04, somewhere around that time. And I was at university studying and began helping out with a few amateur rugby clubs, a few sort of recreational athletes, runners and the like, and sort of looked around to see how I could sort of turn that into a career. And strength and conditioning within rugby specifically at that time was sort of entering a boom. It was kind of the in thing. There were quite a lot of opportunities out there in terms of internships. And so I applied for quite a few. As things go, some get back to you, some don't. Some offer you opportunities, some don't. You just got to take the rough with the smooth. I was lucky enough to get an opportunity at Bristol Rugby, and it turned out quite well because I was studying at UWIC at the time, which is now Cardiff Met. And so I started that internship in May 2005, and it was as the club was moving from the old National One back into the Premiership. And the head S&C guy there, Dave Rowland, gave me that opportunity, and it was just the two of us in that department. So first year back in the Premiership, it was a fantastic experience. It was a lot of work, but I learned an awful lot there. And really after sort of a combination of being in the right place at the right time and making the most of that opportunity, was lucky enough to get a contract as the Academy Strength and Conditioning Coach there at Bristol. And stayed there for just over 6 years, so until May 2011. And during that time was academy conditioner, assistant conditioner, and then ran a department from 2008 till 2011. And it was an incredible time for the club, lots of highs, a few lows as well, which I think is what you get in professional sport, unless you're one of the very fortunate ones and don't have any lows. And then in sort of 2011, I became a little bit disillusioned with the way that the direction that the club was heading in terms of what were their long-term objectives. And at that time, an opportunity arose in Ireland, specifically with Connacht Rugby, to head the department up there. And that was an exciting time for the province. They were entering the Heineken Cup for the first time, albeit on the back of Leinster's success. But you've got to take that luck when it comes your way. And during that time, we enjoyed some good success with the province. They got their best ever finishes in the Celtic League, 3 seasons in the Heineken, including some memorable wins. Toulouse away last year, which is which is probably fair to say the equivalent of David fighting Goliath, but we managed to come out on top. And then really at towards the end of last season, I was looking to move back to the UK to be closer to family and seeing what options were around and whether I need to take some time away from the game or do some extra study. But an opportunity came up with Wasps in London. Dan Barr, the head S&C, rang me up and was looking for someone to take over the strength and power program. And I felt with the way that the club was moving, the players that they'd signed, it was too good an opportunity to turn down, really. So that's probably the long version of where I started, where I've been, and where I am at the moment.
So obviously your role at Wasps at the minute, strength and power coach, is that what it says in the tin?
Yeah, pretty much. Like I run what goes on in the gym, obviously with Dan will just oversee and make sure everything's in line with how he wants the overall program to be run. But in terms of what goes on in the gym, I'll plan and deliver the sessions to all of the senior players, so around 45 players within that squad. Obviously, in addition to that, I'll assist in other areas that I may be required to help in. So whether that's warming the players up for the main rugby sessions, helping out with any of the conditioning for injured players, any of the monitoring that we do. It's a strength and conditioning role with an emphasis on what goes on within the gym environment, really.
I mean, you mentioned a little bit there about monitoring. I watched, listened to a webinar this morning with Jason Webber and Darren Burgess, and they put the questions out to the people that were listening, and a lot of monitoring type questions keep coming back. But what are the methods that, from your experience, that have kind of given you the most useful information?
Yeah, it's a good question. I listened to the webinar as well. It was very good. They're obviously two very good practitioners in their field. But yeah, in terms of monitoring, really, I think it's only as good as what you do with the information. So I've seen systems or heard of systems in organisations where they collect everything, blood, urine, the works, but what they're collecting, are they able to make an intervention in the training process with the information they're collecting? So for me, that's key. The kind of test and the monitoring devices or systems that I've used have been try and keep them pretty simple and straightforward. So what we do at Wasps is quite similar to what I did at Connacht as well. So I don't mind sharing that. Players will come in, they'll weigh themselves in, so body weight. They'll score their sleep, how well they sleep, and how well they think they've recovered from the previous day's training. That's just at our scale of 0 to 10. And then they'll do a couple of exercises, so a sit and reach to assess their hamstring, lower back flexibility, knee to wall for their ankle mobility. Some guys do some shoulder range tests, some hip range tests. And we look at that data and we build up a profile of that player, and then we see whether they're above or below that line. So, for example, if they are down in a certain area, for example, sit and reach, then they have a protocol to follow. They retest, and if it's still down, then we'll go and advise them to see the medical department and have that issue looked at further. In addition to that, I think it's fair to say that most people working in professional sport will collect RPEs. I think they're an invaluable tool. They are subjective, but again, it just gives you another little, as to steal Jason Webber's phrase, in terms of building a case. And I think you can't explain it any better than that, really. You're looking to build a case, whether it's for an individual player or for the squad as a whole. So you can go into the coach and say, the squad's tired today, they haven't recovered well. Automatically, the first thing they're going to do is say, well, why? Show me. How have you formed that opinion? And so there's some of the subjective and objective measures that I would believe in. I think GPS as well is extremely important, but probably from the terms of optimizing training. And I'm not afraid to say, I think when it first came out, probably I was one of a few coaches who made a few mistakes. You try and tell coaches to do less all the time. But I think as time goes on and you see what it can collect and how it can inform your training, it's about optimizing it, not restricting the coaches. I think that's a very important point for anyone that's working within team sports where they have to liaise with the head coach or any of the assistant coaches. So to summarize, I think you've got your wellness, some of your sort of mobility measurements, your GPS, but also as another famous S&C coach, Buddy Morris, says, you can't underestimate talking to your players. At the end of the day, you've got to be able to communicate with them. You've got to be able to have a feel for where they're at, see how they walk, and when they move, when they come into the club, you can tell a lot from that. Are they tired? Have they recovered? So really, for me, it's a combination of all those factors help to build up a profile of each athlete that you work with.
So obviously the last thing you mentioned was the building up of the profile. How long would you say it kind of takes before you get some meaningful data with that profile?
I think in an ideal world, you probably say you start your interventions and your data collection at the start of pre-season. I'd like to think you'd have a good profile of that player by the end of pre-season. So you're probably looking at 8 to 12 weeks in reality. But that might be longer depending on the type of player and the amount of contact time that you have with that player. If they come new to the club after an international period, say in the summer, they only come in July or August, then obviously it's going to take longer. They're going to go right into the season before you get a handle of where they're at. Also, the strength and conditioning industry is quite small now. Everyone knows everyone. So if you do sign a player from another club, I think more often than not, you can usually get some information on that player. Most clubs are pretty forthcoming as long as the information's nothing that's going to give the other person a competitive advantage.
I mean, you mentioned so many different ways to collect the data. How do you kind of cherry pick the right information to relay onto the coach? Because obviously you're not going to present everything in a big long A3 page.
No, it's about trying to present it probably in a way that they can understand. So I can only speak from experiences, and some of the head coaches that I've worked for like something visual. So they might like, for example, if I'm presenting GPS scores from the weekend in comparison to previous games to show that the players worked a lot harder. One coach liked that. Other coaches I've worked with just prefer an informal chat. So I might say to them, player X, can they restrict their high speed? Can we look at restricting their high speed running in today's session? I'll say it's because of X, Y, and Z. So that's just an informal discussion rather than an actual graph or report. So I think from that perspective, it's vital that how your head coach or how your assistant coach or sport coach, whatever it may be, how they like to communicate, and how to persuade them and influence them to sort of come to the same conclusion as you.
Yeah, that's great stuff. I mean, I just wanted to move on a little bit, talking about conditioning in rugby. I posted a couple of questions over to you about aerobic versus anaerobic sessions. I mean, Keir went and flat, one of the guys who previous on the podcast, and anyone who hasn't checked his stuff out, I'd definitely recommend it. But he talks a lot about obviously not neglecting the aerobic side of it. I'm sure you've read his kind of stuff. What are your views on this for rugby?
Not to want to sit on the fence, but to cut a long story short, I think you need to be aerobically developed and anaerobically developed. That being said, I think that you can overdo the aerobic conditioning. I think each player needs a base level of fitness. How you achieve that is probably up to you. There are many different ways to skin a cat. But looking from the experience I've had, usually it takes guys sort of between 3 to 5 weeks to get aerobically fit, maybe slightly less for some, slightly more for others, depending on what state they return to training. Something that I did with a relative degree of success at Connacht is during the off-season, they were set aerobic targets. So we used the yo-yo intermittent recovery test level 1. And then when they returned to train, if they met their target, they got some more time off. If they didn't, they were in. So it was just a way of trying to ensure that when we did start pre-season, we could move into more specific forms of conditioning, whether that's anaerobic work, whether it's small-sided games. So really we tried to make sure that the aerobic conditioning was taken care of in the off-season. I think when you look at the competition you're working in as well, there has to be a slight shift in focus. I think if you're a strength and conditioning coach working in Super Rugby, the games, it's a shorter season. The games are played on better surfaces. It's a faster game, so there's probably more emphasis on having a good aerobic base. Whereas in the Premiership in England, it's a long season. It's a marathon, not a sprint. You probably get good weather at the start and at the end, but in the middle you get the winter, which is horrific. So there are a lot more collisions. It's probably more of an anaerobic game, stop-start. I think I was discussing the other day with Dan Barr at Wasps, and I think he was saying that recently some statistical sort of analysis of international rugby resulted in that on average in each international rugby game is 8 minutes nearly goes to the TMO. So you've got to look at things like that. TMO is just for people that don't know, is the video ref, for want of a better expression. So when you look at that, players have got to be aerobically fit, but probably only to a certain extent. You're not training them to run a sub 5 minute mile. You're training them to be able to last 80 plus minutes. There are going to be periods of very continuous high intensity play, but at the end of the day, the game of rugby is a series of high intensity collisions. And you can watch any of the games. You'll see teams that don't win collisions don't win the game. Simple as that. I mean, my belief is that when you get to international rugby, at least, and probably even in the Premiership and Celtic League, I'd say if you tested all the teams on the yo-yo, there'd be very little to choose between any of them. It's about their ability to win collisions and their ability to play the game, to execute skill under fatigue. So that really would be, my opinion on aerobic versus anaerobic. You need both of them, and it depends on the competition, and also importantly the style of play that the coach is looking to implement.
I mean, you mentioned obviously the amount of collisions that go on. Obviously, so many niggles and guys being strapped up and just get out to the game. Do you use like cross training techniques to kind of maintain the fitness with little niggles that are happening here and there?
Yeah, we would do. I think at the end of the day, if a player is playing regularly each week, then their match fitness is going to be of a good level. And if your training is intense or intense when it needs to be, then sort of your conditioning should be taken care of. But if during pre-season, the last sort of 3 years at Connacht, we did have a couple of players who would have quite a number of miles on the clock. And I would be a fan of using off-feet methods, but where possible, I'd like them to be on the field training. But if I was going to use off-feet methods, I'd be probably, anyone listening to this who knows me will probably laugh now, I'd be a big fan of rowing and the watt bike. I just think they're two very, very efficient methods to improve someone's conditioning. It's measurable, so you can set targets. And you can try and closely relate it to the running work. So, for example, if you were doing some maximal aerobic speed work on the field in terms of running, you can also do exactly the same thing on the row. You give them a 2,000 meter time trial, you get the same kind of data as if they were doing a running test, and then using that to plan their training accordingly. But I think where often not, you need the players on the pitch, but if they can't do that for whatever reason, then those two modalities probably would be my go-to ones.
No, I thought you might say that from a few of the bits that you've put on about the rower. I'm sure the lads love you.
Yeah.
So just moving on a little bit, how do you guys at Wasps integrate the academy players when they're coming through the system?
Yeah. So at the moment, the setup at Wasps is we have 4 strength and conditioning coaches, of which I'm one of with the first team, and then there are 3 strength and conditioning coaches with the academy setup. Now, obviously, the philosophy, if you like, for the strength and conditioning department is set by the head S&C, Dan Barr, and it's also based upon the league we play in and the type of game the coach wants to play. But effectively, we're probably no different than any other Premiership team. We're looking for our players to be powerful, strong, and have a good level of conditioning. So that gets set at the senior level, and then that message gets delivered down to the academy setup. That being said, it's important to understand that the academy players are at different ages, different levels of maturation and development to the senior players. So the academy age players, you're probably looking at guys who are maybe from 13 all the way up to 21. So there are lots of differences. How would you treat a player who's 13? So how would you treat a player that's 21? But I think the key message is that they don't have the miles on the clock that a lot of senior players do. So if you've got a guy moving from the academy system at, say, 19, really you should expect them to be a standout performer within strength and conditioning in terms of their strength and power tests, their conditioning tests, their speed tests as well. So in the past, when I was working in the academy setup in Bristol at the time, the RFU had a system, a double periodisation system, whereby players were taken out of games at Christmas time and went on a sort of a mini pre-season, which worked well. But I also think it's important that you treat those players in that instance individually. Some guys probably do need to carry on playing because their rugby skill is a limiting factor, but for sure, guys whose physical development is a limiting factor, then I think it's something that can produce some very good gains. But also, I'd be a big believer. I think I don't mean to go off on a rant here, but I think that today's society as a whole tends to breed soft individuals. Guys sit all day playing Xbox. The amount of physical education in schools is reduced. Pressure from parents now. Athletes probably specialise at a younger age, which is not a good thing either. They think they're going to be a professional rugby player. They're going to make it when they're 13, when they should be carrying on to play as many different types of sports as possible. So again, I can only speak for myself here, and this is not a sort of a view of Wasps or any other rugby organisation. But I think if I was to be running an academy now, I would make sure that it was sort of discipline and mental toughness and just understanding what it takes to be a professional athlete are really sort of cornerstones of the program. And in addition to that, making sure that every player, and I know at Connacht most of them did, but they have some type of interest outside of rugby. So they're either enrolled in higher education or they're enrolled in learning a trade. I think if you have a player in an academy system who's not doing any of those things, it's not a healthy lifestyle for them. They need to have some distractions away from the rugby environment as well. So I think when you're dealing with academy players, you need to look at it in terms of a holistic approach. You're trying to create better athletes for sure, but you should also be trying to create better people and better people who can fit into society as well. Because some of them will make it as professional players, but quite a few of them won't. So they need to be equipped with the tools necessary to move forward in their lives.
Yeah, I totally agree with the kind of creating a good person as well as a good athlete. When you talk about early specialisation, obviously, but you're taking guys in and every other professional club is taking guys in at 13, and football clubs is getting absolutely stupid with like 6-7-year-olds. As from a Wasp point of view, would you be encouraging these lads to be playing basketball, football, doing gymnastics, going swimming, or is it kind of, this is rugby, you're 13, let's go?
It depends on the age of the player, but I'd say if you're looking at a 13-year-old, then definitely be encouraging them to keep up with their other sports that they play. Obviously, if you've got a guy who's, let's say he's 19 years old, he's in the England 20 setup, he's probably going to get a professional contract with the Wasps if his development keeps going on. Then obviously in his case, he probably wants to be doing less things that are going to detract from his, or make physical and time demands on his schedule in terms of if it's not rugby. But I'd say, definitely at the other end of the spectrum, swimming, gymnastics, as you said, basketball, some other ball sports, definitely encourage them to keep those types of activities up as long as is possible.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, just coming on to a last little thing, I wanted to discuss a recent article by Mark Ripperto that obviously everyone seems to be chipping in on. I just wanted to get I wondered if you'd read it and if just wanted to get your thoughts on some of the issues that he'd mentioned in the article.
Yeah, no, I did read the article. Obviously, he's someone who's a good coach. He has a lot of good resources out there, and is someone who's good at what he does. For me to write an article about the state of S&C coaching, and I think it was within mainly the collegiate system in the US, correct me if I'm wrong, and maybe at the pro level a bit, without ever having worked in it, and I don't know, he may have people who he knows who are close acquaintances who do work in it, but for me, that's almost like me writing an article about strength and conditioning within football. I've never worked in football. I would know, apart from resources I've read and bits that you hear about, I wouldn't be sort of 100% qualified to make those statements. I mean, he's obviously got opinions that he feels very strongly about, and that's his right to put those down, into words and to publish that article on T Nation. For sure, you can see some clips on YouTube of some less than desirable techniques in the hand clean, lots of people screaming in the collegiate system. And, it does, I suppose, to an extent, it does seem a little bit like a circus act, some of those video clips. But again, I think it's, unless you've walked, in those individual shoes, it's very hard to judge what the stress is in their profession, what are some of the demands in their profession, what they're trying to achieve. So, for me, I thought it was a thought-provoking article, which is probably how he intended it to be, but I think it would have probably gone down better if it was written by someone who had experience of having worked in those environments. I'd like to think if I was going to write an article on strength and conditioning in rugby, having worked in it for nearly 10 years, I'd consider myself to know quite a bit about it. But if I'd never worked in it, I would find it hard to write an article on it, if that makes sense. But I think, when you sent the question across to me, there was something in there about, and you might be getting onto it now, but to do with the term functional exercises and some of the uses of speed ladders and gimmicks, if you like. I think for me, the word functional, what does that mean? Does that mean that the other things that you do aren't functional? You only got to look back at people in ancient Greece and Rome were lifting weights above their head, and whether it was rocks and things. So people are always going to be lifting a barbell to get stronger. You're always going to have to squat, press, pull, etc. To make advances in strength training. There's no sense in, you look at people standing on a Swiss spool or doing lots of cable work. That's not going to get you strong. It might go down as a good party trick, but it's not going to influence your performance, particularly in rugby anyway, at least. I think with the whole speed ladders as well, the one thing about speed ladders for me is it teaches you to look down, which is you get the old, can you do the 1 foot in, 1 foot out? Well, the person straight away is looking down, which is a suboptimal body position to have when you're looking to accelerate or generate any type of speed and momentum. I wouldn't be a big fan of either of those things. And my philosophy would revolve around trying to keep things simple and effective, and go with things which I know work and produce results.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned it a little bit, and he kind of went into a lot of detail on people being weak, and obviously the barbell training is kind of the be all and end all. And then there was a picture of Will Fleming doing something in a split stance. Yeah, who's obviously incredibly strong. But I think he had like 10 plates on either side, maybe for a photo shoot or something. So that killed me a little bit. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, we've obviously mentioned Matt Ripito, but who are your other go-to guys that you kind of keep track on social media or blogs or whatever?
Yeah, I've probably got five main ones. So in terms of influences on strength and power and general program management, I think most people would look no further than Dan Baker, and I've been a big fan of his research, especially as it's applied within a professional setting. So he would be one. Ashley Jones, who worked at the Crusaders, the All Blacks and the Wallabies, and I think now is working in Japan, helped me a lot when I first moved into a head role, and I'd recommend anyone to check out any of his work. And I think he's a fantastic practitioner. You don't hold those positions in World Rugby unless you're doing something good. Then also Joe Ken. Again, I'd recommend any up-and-coming coach. I think it's the Strength Coach's Playbook is his first book. I definitely recommend them to buy that. I was lucky enough to hear him speak at the UK SCA this year. Again, he has a very good system. It's relatively straightforward and simple, and it gets results. So those three from a strength perspective. And then I'd probably say in terms of speed and putting a whole program together, Dean Benton, who more recently was working over at the Brumbies, again is someone who's helped me a lot and who I've sought his advice for. I was fortunate to spend some time out there and look at the Brumbies in 2012. And then probably in addition to that, reading Charlie Francis's work as well. And some of the guys who post on Elite FTS as well, but they'd probably be the main ones. And I think if you're into strength and conditioning, whether it's rugby or not, I think the guys that I've listed there would be fantastic resources to look up some of their works. A lot of their work's on the web. Some of it you might have to dig a bit harder, but they're all well-respected practitioners and have a lot more experience and a lot more skills than I do.
Don't do yourself down, mate. So where can people keep up to date with what you've got going on and social media and that type of thing?
Yeah, probably the easiest one is Twitter. So my Twitter name's Tom Mclaughlin 83. So I tend to follow and retweet quite a lot of the more clever people on the internet. I occasionally offer an insight into whether it's anything to do with my training in terms of trying to get better at rowing, which is at the moment seems like an eternal quest, or anything else that I would retweet or offer opinions on, really.
So what's the goal in the rowing?
The goal at the moment is to try and break my 2,000 metre record. So at the moment it stands at 6:56, but it's proving very difficult to get it below 6:56 at the moment. As Andy Churchill testified to when he saw me the other day in a world of pain in the gym before training. So.
No, well, yeah. I mean, I've gone through all the things I wanted to ask you, and it's come up to half an hour, so I don't want to keep you anymore. But I just want to say thanks very much for giving your time and your day off.
No problem. I'd probably just finish with saying that I think anyone who wants to ask any questions, feel free to send me a message or a tweet on Twitter, because I think anyone that's breaking into the field or in the field now and looking to sort of accelerate through the pathways, if you like. When I was in their same position, people like, as I've alluded to, Ashley Jones and other coaches were kind enough to point me in the right direction and offer advice. And I think anyone who holds positions within strength and conditioning has a responsibility to offer that advice and help other people come through the profession. It is a tough profession. There's a lot of demand, if you like, from people to try and get into it. But there's not that many jobs, so it really is about trying to set yourself apart and get as much experience as possible.
So for people that aren't on Twitter, have you got an email address that people...
I have, yeah. So it's tom.mclaughlin@wasps.co.uk.
Cool. And you're happy for people to drop you an email?
Yeah, more than happy. It's not a problem.
Cool. We'll round up there. And again, thanks for your time. And I'll chat to you soon.
No problem. Thanks. Take it easy.
Thanks a lot, mate. See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning to the Pace Performance Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the chat with Tom. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and give me a follow on Twitter @PaceyPerform, where you can keep in touch with everything that's going on in the podcast. But until then, I will speak to you in the next episode.